Okay, so now we're going to move on to our first keynote for the conference, and Dean Sonobe will introduce Professor Pande.
Yes, it's a great honor for me to, moderate this keynote session. Usually moderator introduce the speaker, but Rohini needs no introduction because if you didn't know her, then you wouldn't be here. So, and then I didn't know the title of her speech. So just this is the title. So very happy to invite Rohini to provide a keynote speech. Okay, so join me.
That's fine. So thank you very much for being here. So let me start off by just thanking everyone who's helped in the organization, but also all the participants. I know it's a long way to travel, and certainly Tokyo in March is very nice, but still, I think lots of people got on to 15-hour flights, and I gather from Brazil, it was a very long way. So we're extremely grateful that you've all come here. I'm also really happy actually to sit through the first session because unfortunately, I don't sit through that many conferences which have macro and micro. And as I was listening to it, I sort of felt quite a lot of what I was going to say. I'd love to use that also to start more of a conversation about, how we think about modeling some of these choices. I think microeconomic papers are often extremely unsatisfying in terms of, what they tell us about the world, but maybe one place where they're somewhat useful is to really think at the micro level about interactions within the household. And I think so much of what we're talking about is, what's happening to men versus relative, using the pandemic in this case as one point of crisis. But I think as was mentioned by Charity at the start of the conference, climate change is going to probably bring similar crisis points in the future. And I think the more we can understand the interaction between what happens in the marketplace and what happens at home, I think the more important we will learn what to do. And so just to highlight, I think the one place where I would like to think that we can perhaps make more progress is in really kind of unbundling what we think of sometimes as the income effect. And maybe even also these issues of comparative advantage at home production. I think there's been a lot of, further work in really thinking about is, are they just very reduced from ways of measuring just ways in which men's and women's choices are often shaped by, say, informal institutions or norms. So I think another thing I hope to do here is there's going to be, I think, a lot of discussion, even in this conference, about talking about the role of gender norms. But that's often kind of kept quite distinct from thinking about our models of the household. And here, we're drawing a work that a lot of this work in general is joined with Simone Shainer and Charity Moore and a few other co-authors. But it's really trying to argue that, if you want to take norms seriously, we can't just think of it separate from how things like the income effect play out. So what I want to do today is, I think, first just use some data to talk about a fact that I think has been mentioned by many already, that we know that women fared worse than men at the start of the pandemic. But in the developing world, we are seeing this persist. I think we're not seeing this persist so much necessarily in rich countries, but we're seeing this persistent in lower countries. And I want to turn to just some detailed longitudinal data to really give you a set of descriptive facts from this CMI data that longitudinally follows individuals every 3 or 4 months to really see what are we seeing happening in the labor markets. And interestingly, I think one thing is going to relate to is what Marsha was talking about is, it looks like kind of what's happening in urban labor markets for women in particular is very important. I want to then turn to just some very brief mention of experimental evidence. And as I said, this is joined with Simone and Charity and some other co-authors. And this is really where I think I want to at least make a bit of a more substantive point on really how you can sometimes use these kind of settings to really ask questions like, what can you explain by just an income effect, or where do you actually see that norms may be important to look at these effects and not just income effect? And then very briefly in the end, I'll just talk about a couple of other issues that seem to be important for women, but you would not get in the data in India, but much more in places like, say, Bangladesh, where we see high labor force participation, or Philippines, where we see more international migration. And I should also really thank Eric, who helped me hugely with putting together all these slides. So how women fared through the pandemic? So if you look at the most recent data on just labor force that we can see, which is from the end of 2021, and you ask what was the change compared to 2019, you're beginning to see recovery, but not full recovery in most places, except perhaps in Europe, where actually women look at the same level of labor force participation as pre-pandemic. But I think what's striking is when you look at the gender gaps in failure to recover, they're really concentrated in lower income settings. So Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then really strikingly in South Asia. And this slide in some ways is the motivation for looking at South Asia, that 2 years after the pandemic, what we're seeing is that women's failure to recover to the levels of labor force participation 2019 is twice as high for women relative to men. And one other fact that you see, this is a confusing graph in a lot of ways, but think of these, I guess, two triangles on top of each other, I'm not sure what to call them, are the levels of female labor force participation in 2019. And then this is the change in the gender gap over time. And what you see is that countries that started with higher levels of female labor force participation see on average less of an increase in the gender gap relative to those that are low down. So if you look, for instance, at Pakistan or India, which start with very low female labor force participation, this is where we see the largest additional gender gap emerge during the pandemic. And the third fact, which is, I think, at the household level, and this is from World Values Survey, which is stacked together for the last 10 years, if you just look at the expression of restrictive norms, so this idea that when jobs are scarce, men should have more access to jobs than women, it correlates a lot with what you might think about economic insecurity. So when there is higher economic insecurity, and in some ways this is striking because you may expect it to be the opposite, you find those are times where there's more expression of restrictive gender norms. And again, this is, I think, one of the things that has been often talked about, but we have less evidence on, is, to what extent is the persistence of the worst experience of women after the pandemic coming from the fact that this actually became a period where the labor markets became tighter. During that time period, sort of men came to the first of the queue, not necessarily because they were more qualified, but because there was more of a reemergence of these more restrictive gender norms. I'll be able to show you a little bit of data on this from our experimental setting. So as I said, I think we have by now a large body of evidence saying that if you look at the immediate period after the pandemic, it was really kind of a combination of intra-household dynamics, the fact that women saw more of a need to engage in childcare, nature of work, the fact that women were often working in these face-to-face industries in things like retail or beauty, which actually saw much more of a hit during the lockdown. So compared to previous recessions, many people have called the pandemic leading to a she recession where women lost more jobs. So that was, I think, what we saw just after the pandemic. And I want to ask, when we look at this literally 3 years later, are these forces still at work and how do they matter? And what we're going to see in the data is, I'm going to give you a slice of the data, but from everything certainly I have looked at, we find that we are seeing differences in how men and women are getting back to the labor market across dimensions. First of all, geographic location. So I think this rural-urban split seems to be important in a lot of settings. Household dynamics, exactly how childcare, for instance, played out, or how existence of norms mattered. Economic status, what kind of industries were men and women to start in? So I think the experience will say Bangladesh, where there were a lot of women already working in garment industry, which really didn't shut down for very long, was very different than, say, Philippines, where you had a lot of international migrants who came back. And all of this together, of course, to the extent it affects your access and control to resources, might lead back to these getting perpetuated further on. So just to, again, summarize, I think if you look at some of these sort of estimates just globally at the estimates, it seems like on average, I showed you the break across countries, and this is slightly more, I think, recent data from the ILO. which basically says, at least in terms of working, on average, men's employment has recovered, but there are 13 million less women who are employed today. And this is reflected also in this lower recovery of rates. We also continue to see, I think, some things that happen that actually have longer term persistence. I'm not going to talk about them. I think it's important to remind ourselves that we see increased isolation very often in the data. We also see increased reporting of gender-based violence. I think we have, and I'm not going to talk to it, but I wanted to mention it. We don't know very much about how this is actually persisting over time. I think there was a lot of evidence right at the time of lockdowns of what happened, but to the extent that women are more vulnerable, there may be other dimensions other than just being in the house that may be together that are contributing to this persisting. And we know that we saw increases in dropout from school for women at a higher rate, and higher rates of child marriage. And these are, again, also channels that are going to persist. But these are not going to be what I want to talk about, but I just wanted to mention them as important other channels. So what I want to turn to now is just first some descriptive facts from what we see in India. And I'm going to look at the CMI CPHS data just to remind you it has been a controversial data set for reasons of people arguing whether or not it's representative, but certainly I think what people will not disagree with, it is the only data we have that will allow us to follow households at reasonably frequent intervals. So they have 3 rounds per year, and they have longitudinal data that we then see on employment, earnings, and savings. I'm not going to, for most part, be using the longitudinal aspect, but I just want to use it to show you some descriptives. So just to remind you, in general, the way I'm going to show these data is if you try to put men and women in labor force participation in India on the same axes, of course, you can never see both together because they have such different levels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to index them both at 100 in 2020, January 2020, just before COVID, and then sort of show you the change relative to that point. So this is all relative. And so in the bottom, I'm just going to give you the levels in case you want to think about it. So in 2020, at the point where I'm indexing them at 100, female labor force labor force participation for men in blue was 76%, and at least in the CMI data was 13%. So that's the difference you see. And then these 2 gray bars throughout are going to be the 2 periods of the lockdown. Now, what you see is, actually men have not fully recovered in this data set. They're still slightly lower, but you see certainly that women remain significantly lower at this point relative to when they were indexed at 100. So we see a lower recovery for more exit for women. And then when you look at this, so these 4 lines are the male lines that are a bit confusing because they really overlap. So the blue and the green are male labor force participation, and they really overlap roughly flat. What we see is rural women was slightly higher to begin with in terms of participation, and this gap has really increased. And this is, I think, well documented at this point in the Indian literature. So what you should really look at is in India, similar to what's happening in China, it's really urban women who are bearing the brunt and continue to bear the brunt. And similarly, when you look at, so they have income per member of every household from all sources. Again, when you look at this, unsurprisingly, there's a huge dip in household income during the first lockdown. There's a reasonable recovery, which then fell again during the Delta wave. But then when you look here, again, what you see is rural women, if anything, may even be looking slightly better than they did before. And some people have actually used this to argue that, rural labor force participation are rising. But what you certainly see is that urban women are not getting back in terms of income. And then if you look at financial coping by gender, what we show you again is that in terms, so this is, I should talk about the notation, this is different. What we don't have here in the CMI is we have this data at the level of the household. So we don't have individual by individual kind of savings or borrowing behavior. So what we did is we just decomposed it by the gender balance in the house, gender composition of the household, which is certainly not great, but more than 2/3 female is probably capturing most households where which are female headed, but they're probably also capturing others which have more, say, daughters in it. And again, what you see here is, these more than 2/3 female households look the worst throughout, And here they see more of a break, a gap in the ability to borrow from the bank. And I think this is important because one feature that people talk about that happened in India around the same time is just increased digitization and many hope, increased ability to access savings and other things, but we don't see that in this data that much. So this is just overall facts. And then let me turn to one more fact before I turn to the experimental data. And this actually builds a little bit on a summary statistic that Michael put up on his last slide, which I think we know very well, which is that especially among rural women, government either directly through the public sector or something like NREGA, the social safety net that provides employment, is a huge employer of women. So if you look at rural employment and you look at the proportion of workers report that they're working for government, and this includes, I think, typically NREGA work, you can see it's twice as high among women in rural areas, while it's quite similar in urban areas. And this in general, I think is in some, I was very glad to see Michael's statistic, because I think this is something for any of us who've been in the field, we hear all the time that no matter what the norms are, government jobs are somehow always much more acceptable. And that includes, I think, NREGA work. So I want to focus in, before I turn to sort of urban sector and talk about what didn't work there, let me talk about what did work. I want to talk about what happened in rural India during the pandemic and just after. So what we find is that, these safety nets, in particular, India's federal workfare program that provides, in theory, a guarantee of 100 days work for every rural household if they want it, was quite successful in, especially just after the pandemic. I think anecdotally, and I'll then turn to experimental evidence, NREGA, when we just look at the performance across states, they seem to have worked better, at least for rural women in states where it was well implemented, where the wages were directed to women's own accounts, and women seem to have had some previous experience with accessing it. So let me now turn to sort of some evidence from an experimental setting that we've been working for a long period of time. So I'm going to talk about some data we have where we ran a field experiment in 2014, and we have 3 points of survey, 2 pre-pandemic, 2015 and 2017, and then 1 in 2022, which is post-pandemic. It's in a very poor part of Madhya Pradesh and a part of rural MP that's also got quite regressive gender norms. And these just give you a sense of what the women's status was at baseline, which is, I just highlight the fact that only 28% of women say that they had a say in whether they worked for pay, and only 30% worked. So I'm going to actually focus in on the results I'll show you on a subsample, which is women who had never said they had not worked at baseline, and we're going to call these constrained women. And I think this is more generally, I think this is something where we can actually think about what would a model say that didn't account for norms. Right, so if this is a poor area, but there are many women who are not working. So, in a model without norms, you would say it's perhaps reached a point where women have a comparative advantage at working at home, or there is this income effect where the husbands are earning enough that they're choosing not to work. I think we want to argue that that kind of model actually cannot explain what we see in the data. You're going to probably have to bring in a model where men will have more normative constraints than women. So they actually get greater disutility from their wife working than their wife gets disutility from working. And so in a world where men get more disutility from their wives working and they have more bargaining power, women will not work. Now, if you do things that increase their income share or increase their bargaining power, these women might actually enter the labor force. This is not predicted by a model without norms. In a model without norms, if you increase unearned earnings or even earned earnings for women, they should actually exit even more because they have disutility from leisure. And I think this is something which I love to continue this conversation with the macroeconomists, because I think this is a feature we're now seeing increasingly in a number of micro models, that we see a difference in adherence, maybe not adherence, but difference in belief or acceptance of norms among men and women. women in many settings state that they want to work at much higher rates than their husbands say they are willing to let their partners work. And this both plays out, I think, before marriage in terms of women's concerns of what will happen to them in terms of parents' concerns of what will happen to their daughter's spousal options if they work. Also post, where women may want to work but may not be able to work because of normative constraints imposed on them than others. And I think that's a very different model than the income effects model, and perhaps much more similar to Esther Bosroup's work, who talked about the kind of marginalization of women at the time of structural transformation, rather than sort of the Beckerian view that we see out there. So just to give you a sense, this is a setting where I'll talk a bit about the experiment, but one thing you should know is that what we did is we worked with the government to make sure that all women had access to a banking account. And these are all women who had access to a banking account. And one thing we see here when we look at questions in the 2022 survey on how men and women reacted to pandemic coping mechanisms, women are now much more likely to take out money from savings. So the fact, but they do have less borrowing of money. Mostly what everyone did was that they reduced consumption of essential items. So let me talk about now what actually this intervention did very briefly. So what we did in this was we essentially worked with a population where none of the women had bank accounts at the beginning, and we opened bank accounts for all of them. This was before the big government move for opening bank accounts. We then took a subsample of them, linked their bank accounts to payments from the federal workfare program. So if you recall what I said, the federal workfare program guaranteed 100 days work at actually gender equal wage for households. But the status quo had been that basically the wages would get deposited into the kind of household heads account, which was a male account. So women would work, but their money would typically go into the account of their husband. And you can imagine, like with any friction, the amount of money you can recover in that case is less than in a world where your own account is linked for your payments. So we basically, in other words, we just basically ensure direct deposit of payments into your own bank account. And then cross randomized it with some account training, which in this particular case seemed to be important. So what we see over time, and I'm showing you the results for the set of constrained women, we saw significant increases in labor supply. And these increases in labor supply, I think, have been persistent over time, including through the pandemic. And I think this result in itself is inconsistent with the really basic household model, where essentially what happens is when you have a direct deposit system, women, the same work, women are getting more money is coming into their account. At this point, they should probably, if in a simple model, they should work less. And certainly someone who was already not working at the start should not begin working because of this constraint being relaxed. But that's what we see here. And this is, I mean, it's reassuring that we see the same pattern when instead of our surveys, we actually just look at administrative data from the bank on what happened to their bank accounts. And what you see that when the lockdown began, you can see that the people who had, in this case, we're comparing women who had direct deposits and training to those who had just bank accounts. So this is, as I said, our control group also got bank accounts to ensure we were not picking up just an effect of financial inclusion. So that's what we see. And I think that's the kind of the good news, that through the pandemic, if you had a well-designed gender intentional financial system, it seems to benefit women and work well for them. The second part of it that I think we want to ask about is what happens to perceptions about the appropriateness of work. So when we had done our 3-year follow-up in 2017, what we found is that women who were in this group of getting the direct deposits and training had stated more agreement with the statement that it's appropriate for a woman to work, and actually reduced their agreement to some extent with what the perceptions of the community were. So now when we look at this aggregate norms index, so this is really captures a set of questions which includes your personal beliefs that a woman can work, you prefer a daughter-in-law who works for pay, and you prefer a son-in-law who lets their daughter work for pay. and an index that sort of believes that a working woman is better along many dimensions, that she's a better wife, better mother, and a better caretaker. And so when you look at 2017, you see that in the treatment group, all of these agreement with this is higher. So in general, you're sort of more positive that you can work and not be a worse caregiver for it. And we see this persist in 2022. But where we see a very significant change in is your perceptions of what others think. So this is composed of, do you think working women are viewed with more respect, and the fraction of the community who will not think poorly of working women, and also perceptions of husband's acceptance, that a working woman's husband is viewed with more respect, and the fraction of community who will not think a working woman's husband is a bad provider. And I think this is where we see results that are somewhat concerning. We see a very significant decline, obviously significant decline in perceived norms, which may actually suggest that while rural women sort of remained in what you may think of as distress employment in NREGA, their ability to, especially of young women, to enter work may be constrained in a tight labor market. So let me now, how much time do I have left? Okay, great. So I think, let me now turn to urban women, and kind of, I think this is, to me, still an area we need a lot of work. And so I actually don't have like a comprehensive explanation. I'm going to just focus in on one part of it. So just to remind you, across, there's a study by ILO very recently in 2023 that actually looks across several countries, across 11 countries in Asia, and notes that the decline in urban women's labor force participation was 3 times that of rural women, even in very recently across Asia. And so, as I said, I'm going to focus in on just a single subgroup here, which is female urban migrants. So these female urban migrants are often young women who are unmarried and who move, for instance, say in Michael's model, these are the ones who are going to be showing up in beauty parlors, in places. And we want to kind of look at what we can understand from them. So just before doing that, let me go back to the CMIE data and just show you some trends by marriage. So this is now looking at labor force participation by the combination of gender and marriage. And I want you to look at this group, which is unmarried women and unmarried women in the labor force. And what we see is that the unmarried women have actually not recovered at all. So relative to unmarried men, or married women, their recovery has been relatively low. And these are the group that you might think face potentially fewer, apparently we may think face fewer constraints, although we'd argue otherwise, right? One thing I just highlight before that, because I think people often don't realize this, is that India is, one thing that's striking about India is that actually unmarried women don't work very much in either a rural or urban area. So unlike a lot of settings where you have this sort of M shape where women enter the labor force at the same rate as men, but then drop out at the point of childcare. So in rich countries, that leads to everyone talking about it all in terms of child penalty. Certainly in India, and I think also in Pakistan, what we see is women just don't enter. There's something about what you either think working is signaling for the marriage market, most likely, that mean that women don't enter. It could also be that women migrate very often at the time of marriage, and so parents don't see it worth their while to have them enter. But just to point out that they were both in 2020 at this point actually at the same level of low work rate, but then unmarried women have done worse at recovering after the pandemic. So I'm going to focus on one group that, again, with Charity and Simone and other co-authors we followed, which are urban working women who migrated back at the time of the lockdown. So many of you probably kind of read it on some newspaper that, India had this extreme national lockdown, but given the very large presence of labor in urban informal sector, there was a very large transition back of these individuals, both men and women, to their natal areas, to the rural areas. And many people say that since the construction of India and Pakistan, this was the largest internal migration over a short period we saw, where roughly 10 million, in India numbers are always large, but 10 million internal migrants returned to rural areas from urban centers. So what we did, and I think this built on kind of the partnerships we had with our state governments, is that we were able to recover from the state governments lists of returned migrants. So very often they were keeping these lists either through monitoring train stations or actually otherwise, because they had to provide these migrant centers and quarantine facilities. And we took a gender stratified random sample of urban migrants who had returned back to rural areas in North India. And then we enrolled them into a phone-based panel survey. We first focused on distress, and then we looked across over the next year into how well they were able to return. So the gray bars just show you the waves, survey waves. So this is the first place where you'll see basically everyone is back home. And then we see them through the recovery phase, 2 recovery phases. This is the time where India had a second COVID wave, and then just after the second COVID wave. So what I want to show you today are results from a subsample of these who we are able to track through all of them. So, phone-based surveys, it's hard to maintain them over time. So these are returning migrants who participated in rounds 2 to 4. So they remained through the sample, and they were working before the pandemic. So it's a selected sample, but this was 99% of the men and 66% of the women. These are all individuals who were working before the pandemic. So to give Charity a lot of credit for figuring out how to produce these graphs in part. But what you see here is in the first wave, they were all by definition almost in the village. And then what we're trying to see is that transition across the recovery phase and COVID wave of, how many of them remained in the village and how many actually moved back out from the village. And so I think, what you can see here is essentially through this period for women, a larger share of them, once they were in the village, stayed in the village. Fewer of them managed to actually transit out compared to men. I think this is related to the fact that what is true in the data is there's a very large income difference between what you earn in a village versus what you earn in an urban area. And so the fact that there was this difference in the rates of return to urban areas also meant that there's a gender earning gap that emerged during the course of recovery. And so when we look at the earnings as a share of pre-lockdown value, for men, they haven't fully recovered, and especially after the second wave, they were back down, but they were certainly they had recovered roughly twice as much as women had recovered at this point. So we see essentially the slower ability of women to migrate back out again, then reflecting in worse earnings. And you can see this in many different ways. Here, I think what's important is just to break it down by whether you stayed inside the village or outside the village. So again, if you look at men who basically managed to move outside the village, they recover much more. They recover roughly 80% of the earnings share if they're back in urban areas. But women actually, even if they manage to migrate, don't recover that much. So, and I think that's the part we don't fully know about what happens in the urban area. But certainly both men and women who remain at home don't recover much at all. So I think a lot of the story is just women not being able to leave a second time around. And some perhaps is also the fact of their opportunities when they get back to urban areas. Let me skip this, let's focus on this. When we ask the reasons for not seeking work by gender, for women, the 2 reasons you do see is pregnancy and domestic duties. So domestic duties is roughly twice as much as that for men. They are not more likely, and if anything, what's interesting is that men are more likely to say they're not interested in going back, right? So there's this other view that you saw such a terrible side of working in an urban area when the pandemic hit and you had to go back, that maybe just decided it's just the utility of being in a rural area is much higher, even at a lower wage. But that, if anything, is lower for women. And you can sort of see why, because in a lot of ways, they have a much more constrained lifestyle when they're in a rural area relative to urban. So really, the big driver seems to be much more about domestic duties and childcare, much less about not being interested. And so just to kind of zoom out from this, I think what we found, I think, quite comparable to what we see in terms of the life cycle of who was affected, that young female and unmarried migrants faced worse in a lot of areas. So for instance, again, from the same ILO study, what you find that women's labor force participation 15 to 24 declined and remained low, much more than those above 25. And I think there's an open question at this point is what can we be doing to serve this population, which I think still remains at risk 3 years later. Many of them may have transitioned into marriage, but I think this is a group that is particularly vulnerable. So let me spend the last bit of time I have, and I think I will please Christina by helping us make up time, is by just talking about a couple of other countries, because I think these are also important groups of women whose experiences we need to understand across Asia. And, this is not going to be experimental data or detailed descriptive, much more a summary of the evidence we found. So let me start about the Philippines. So what do we see in the Philippines in terms of facts? So when you look at women here, what we find is, female labor force participation actually did not decline for women. If anything, we see an increase in FLFP, but we also see an increase in male participation. And so as a result, overall, we see some increase in the gender gap. And again, when we look at this across quintiles, we see that the childcare and illness is the primary reason, especially in the middle of the quintile, but throughout. And just to remind you, I think one of the reasons why I think this is interesting in Philippines is one of the countries in Asia which has a very large number of international migrants. So Filipino migrant workers represent 11% of the population, and the majority of them are women. And again, as I said, this is not more descriptive. And ADB has actually studied this quite a lot. What they report is that women both had more childcare and other responsibilities when they came back, very similar to what we saw in India for internal migration. And then I think importantly also the fact that if returning back is putting you in debt in different ways, it may actually be harder for women to reintegrate because they actually have less access to financial services. I think we saw that earlier as well. So, and again, I think in the Philippines, there was actually relatively limited social protection. But I think the kind of, one of the features that this suggests, I think it more broadly suggests is we should not just look at labor market recovery, but we should also look at things like, for instance, how much debt households and individuals got during the pandemic and where they are. I think we far too often are just relating recovery from the pandemic to whether you're back in the labor force. And I think a lot of what you hear is people are back in the labor force, but they have a lot more debt than they had before that. And then finally, I think Bangladesh, I think at some level, Bangladesh was described even through the pandemic as a success story because garment industries shut down for a really short amount of time. They opened up very fast relative to other sectors. And just to remind you, sort of in Bangladesh, 28% of working women in Bangladesh are in the garment sector. And, relative to other sectors, like for instance, domestic workers, they saw much less job loss. But there are a lot of narratives of how they ended up with lower quality jobs. And I think that's another part that we don't fully understand is what happened to quality of jobs differentially for men and women. But there's certainly some suggestive evidence that women returned when they did worse quality of jobs. So here, for instance, at least on wages, they report that the gender gap in wages increased. So let me just end with, I think, some key messages, but also I think a set of questions that I think they left at this point. I think even just after the pandemic, there was a lot of agreement around the statement that norms or ways in which women were seen as more responsible for childcare or other aspects were important in restricting their re-entry into the labor force. I think in places from what we see from, for instance, the federal workfare program in India, that social safety nets and in our experiment control over wages seem to really matter in making women being able to stay on in the labor force. We also find, and I think this is part of what's happened in urban areas, but certainly not all of it, is that female migration just across these settings has been both domestic and internationally much more vulnerable to these economic shocks. And I think the two questions is, how are we going to support, I think very specifically, kind of safe and sustainable labor migration by women? And I think especially for countries like Philippines and Indonesia, these are going to be important questions as the world reopens. And then I think, of course, the kind of the elephant in the room always is, how do we change gender norms? And maybe that's going to lead to David's talk tomorrow on thinking about that. But one other thing I would say at this point is I think a lot of what we see here resonates very strongly with, I think, what might happen with kind of climate shocks, right? I mean, we already know that climate migration in many parts of Asia is largely male migration. So in countries like Nepal, you're seeing women and children left behind in these villages. That's another side of what we might see is happening in these periods of vulnerability. And I think one thing that would be useful is to think of how we can take this data or learnings that we are seeing from the pandemic, extrapolate to get some sense of what are going to be the gender disparities in events like climate change. So let me stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohini, for the great presentations. You began with concise but powerful overviews of the differences in the vulnerability and the recovery between the women and men, and between rural and urban areas. And then he talked about the policies and experiments and then norms, and then migrants. So very, very rich keynote speech. Thank you very much. And then we have a few minutes, but if you have urgent question, please raise your hand. Okay, so.
Hello. Yeah. Just have two questions. One, the reverse migration for the rural India, because the agriculture sector fared well, gave a lot of employment, and particularly agriculture sector engages more women than men folk. So that we need to see. The second one for a country like us in India. So what is the sample size you put it actually? Because it's a huge population. You take survey of 4,000 people or 10,000 people. How do you just extrapolate to the kind of 1.4 billion we talk about? So we really wanted to understand, being an economist, I'm a layman because I'm an agriculturist. So I'm putting the question from the other side. So how do you really see the sample size when you want to really assume the policy is going to take a kind of a extrapolation point?
Thank you. I think in the migration study, and your point is very well taken on it, I think we stayed a little bit away from policy prescriptions for that reason, But let me first start with the first point. So I completely agree that I think agriculture did well in India for those 2 years, but that's exactly why I emphasized a lot this choice of do not want to, or were not interested in remigrating. If this was the case that women were employed a lot more, we should have seen the willingness to say that you're not interested in remigrating to be similar for men and women. Instead, we see it's roughly half that for women than men. So it seems like it's not, I completely agree with you. I think the rural sector did well in this period. I think that's a good explanation for why a lot of men didn't go back. And I think I showed you in the data, men were not going back. The other thing to keep in mind, no matter how well the agricultural sector is doing, the earnings gap is huge between rural and urban India. So, it's not, it could well be that, part of being not interested that you earn enough in agriculture and you've just discovered this dark underbelly of being an urban migrant, so you don't want to do the combination. But it's certainly not just income effects that's driving it. In terms of, how do you extrapolate? As I said, I think, one of the big things that came out of the whole Indian lockdown and the migration was a realization of how poorly we collect migration data. So, I think I'd say two things in answer to you. First, some data is better than none. And actually, much of the story of migration in India was people had no idea what was happening here. So I think even if this is a limited sample, and as I said, it's a selected sample, not just being returned migrants, but we're conditioning on everyone who worked at the time in urban India. I think it's important to see what's happening in this sample, and hopefully it encourages people to try to collect larger and more representative samples. The second is, as I said, I think we didn't in the papers try to push much on policy for that reason. I think if you want to start coming up with large policy recommendations, I think you have to think a lot more about the populations you represent. I think this is just saying, here are a set of facts, they resonate with what we see in the data, and hopefully we see more desire to kind of collect. I think what's important is collect longitudinal data, right? I think the big thing here is people went back, and just having one-off cross-sectional surveys of urban migrants won't tell us about kind of how many people who went back are not coming back versus new migrants coming in.
That's good. And just to add a point here, you can say take the seasonal migration because it's pre-pandemic or post-pandemic. Typically, the agriculture sector works for a season of 6 months or 9 months. Then people migrate to the urban region. And if you factor in that part of it, whether you are considering the pandemic as a different set of factor, just see to understand the nitty-gritties, there is a seasonal migration also happens. So when you really study, is it the part of the seasonal migration or the regular migration due to pandemic? I think you need to have a little deep dive into that.
To give you
Thank
a
you.
reference to the paper. So, I mean, obviously, for
Thank you. We'll go through it.
Yeah, I think it'd be great
Thank you.
once you look at that, discuss it further.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohini, for the further insights. And thank you, SB, Gurgan, for the question. And let's end this keynote session. And then let's have lunch. Do you have an announcement?